The town of Greenville has always lived quietly and steadily, like a river that flows through it, carrying its waters without ever changing its course. Everyone here knew each other, and secrets were whispered on porches and in cramped kitchens. The Stewart family was one of the most influential in Greenville. They were involved in real estate, owned several stores, and had connections to local officials. No one dared to say anything bad about them, but everyone knew it was better not to quarrel with them. Nathan and Leanne Stewart grew up in a house their parents built on the edge of the forest. Large, with a white veranda, this house always seemed hospitable to outsiders, but inside, there was a special atmosphere. Something invisible had connected Nathan and Liana since childhood. Even their parents could not explain this strange closeness. Even though Nathan was only 2 years older than Liana, he always treated her as if he were responsible for her every move. The other siblings in the family were never this close, but they did not see anything unusual in this. It was just family bonding, as the locals used to say, when children always stuck together. Over the years, their bond only grew stronger. After their father's death, they became even closer. They worked together, managed the family business, and made all decisions together. In the city, they were considered great business partners, despite the fact that Nathan sometimes seemed too strict with his sister, and Leanne was silent and mysterious. But for Greenville, it was nothing. Tonight was no different. Leanne sat on the porch, watching the dusk fall over their property. Her hands, folded in her lap, trembled slightly. Something invisible was weighing on her. She had always been calm and balanced, but lately even Nathan had noticed that something was wrong with her. "Leanne, is everything okay?" Nathan's voice was low and confident as always as he stepped out onto the veranda from the house. She looked up and forced a smile, but it was strained. "Yes, of course," she replied. He sat down next to her, took her hand, and looked at her as if he were looking only at her. It was that special look that no one else noticed except Liana. The usual brotherly relationship between them had long since disappeared. At first it was something innocent, just closeness, trust, support. But now, when they were almost alone, their bond took on a completely different tone. Liana could feel it. Her heart beat faster every time Nathan touched her or was just near her, and he never seemed to let go of her. "You think too much," Nathan said, gently pushing a strand of her hair away from her face. Liana looked away. She couldn't answer him. She couldn't tell him that it wasn't the fear of their connection that was bothering her, but the fact that sooner or later it would all come out. Neighbors, co-workers, even Thomas, everyone will start to suspect something. But would they be able to understand it? She couldn't explain it herself. "I'm just tired," she mumbled. "You're always tired. Maybe you need to go somewhere. Get some rest." His voice was insistent but gentle. Liana shook her head. Rest would not solve her problem. The problem wasn't the place or the circumstances. It was the two of them. But she didn't know how to change that. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door opening downstairs. It was Thomas, a family friend. He was much older than they were, had worked with their father, and after his death had stayed by their side, helping them with the business. Thomas often visited them in the evening, although Nathan had become more distant from him lately. "Sorry to bother you," he said as he came up to the veranda. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay." Nathan nodded and turned to him. "Everything is fine, Thomas, as always. Sit down with us if you want," he said, his voice a little chilly, which Thomas couldn't help but notice. Thomas frowned, but sat down next to him. He'd been watching this family for years and had seen more than they realized. This was especially true of Nathan and Leanne. Ever since they were teenagers, Thomas had noticed that their closeness was unusual, even for such close family ties. But it was none of his business. He wasn't going to interfere. At least that's what he told himself. "You both work very hard," Thomas said, looking at Liana, who looked away. Leanne just nodded. "How are you doing, Thomas?" Nathan asked dryly, changing the subject. Thomas spoke briefly about his affairs, but his eyes kept gliding over Liana from time to time. Something was changing in her. Her quiet demeanor seemed even quieter, as if she was hiding something, and it worried him. But how to tell Nathan? They had always been too close, and Thomas knew that his words could arouse unnecessary suspicion, so he decided to keep quiet. The evening passed slowly, the conversation barely hanging on by a thread, but something was invisibly hovering over the veranda. Thomas realized that it was better to leave early. "I'll leave you," he said, getting up. "I'll see you tomorrow." Nathan nodded goodbye, but Leanna barely reacted. Her mind was far away, barely aware that Thomas had left. Night fell on the city, covering all the streets in thick darkness. Leanna remained sitting on the veranda, staring into the depths of the night. Nathan had gone inside, but Leanna knew he would be back soon. He always came back to be with her, even when she asked him not to. They were no longer just brother and sister, and that scared her more than anything. The city of Greenville has always been proud of its history, and especially of those who have kept long family traditions alive. The Stewarts were one of those families. They had been rooted in Greenville since their ancestors farmed and then grew the family business into a sprawling real estate empire. It was a family that was respected, even feared, but no one could have imagined that dark secrets could be hidden inside this wealthy home. Nathan and Leanne have always been special. Since childhood, their bond has amazed family and friends. Other children in the family played together, but were not as inseparable as these two. They could play for hours in their own world, fenced off from the others. They understood each other without words. Nathan's eyes reflected care, and Leanne's eyes reflected the unwavering belief that Nathan would always be there to protect her. Their mother, Mrs. Stewart, often told her friends, "They are like two halves of a whole. They are always together, like Siamese twins." Her voice sounded proud, but sometimes with a touch of concern. The other children did not have this special bond. Although Nathan and Leanna remained good students, they did not often play with their peers or seek out friends outside their small circle. As children, they often hid in the old house in the backyard where they used to store their tools. No one else went there except Nathan and Leanna. It was their private place. In this house, they created a whole world of fantasies, in which there were only the two of them. It was there, among the old wooden walls and dusty toys, that they first realized how strong their bond was. Nathan was her rock. As a child, Leanna was often sick, and he would always sit next to her until she fell asleep, holding her hand. Her parents thought it was cute, but for Nathan, it was more than a duty. It was his life, to take care of Leanna, to protect her from everything. They were always together at school. Other kids tried to make friends with Nathan, but he never responded to their attempts. Leanna was his only real friend, his only real family. When their paths diverged for a short time, for example, during classes or school activities, Leanna always felt lost. It was difficult for her to focus on anything other than her brother. Teachers noticed that Leanna was absent from the classroom in her thoughts, but did not pay much attention to it. It was during one of these school days that Nathan gave her a diary. It was an ordinary notebook with a soft cover, but it became something more for Leanna. She wrote down everything there, her thoughts, fears, dreams, and most importantly, her feelings for Nathan. Of course, she couldn't tell anyone, not even him. All these entries remained her secret, hidden in this diary. It was her only way to keep what was going on in her heart. No one but her knew about this diary. She kept it in an old box, hidden under a pile of things in her bedroom. Leanna was afraid that someone would find it and learn about her forbidden thoughts. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't help herself. Thomas was an old friend of the Stewart family. He had worked for their father when he was alive, and after his death, he continued to keep in touch with the family. His friendliness and dedication to the Stewarts made him an important figure in their lives. But with each passing year, Thomas became more and more suspicious. His intuition always told him that something was wrong between Nathan and Leanne. He couldn't explain it, but he could feel the tension in their behavior, especially in recent years. One evening, as Thomas was helping Nathan with another project at work, he observed Leanna sitting across the room. She barely participated in the conversation, only occasionally answering questions or making brief remarks. Thomas noticed that Nathan always looked at her with excessive attention, as if he was afraid something would happen to her. This was not the usual concern of an older brother. No, it was something deeper. "She's tired," Nathan said, noticing Thomas's gaze on Leanna. Thomas nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just work. He had seen the way Leanne looked at Nathan when she thought no one was looking. It was a look he couldn't understand. "You both work hard," Thomas said, trying to change the subject, but he was interested in other things. After the conversation fell silent, Thomas recalled an incident from his past that had been tormenting him. Many years ago, when Nathan and Leanne were still teenagers, Thomas came to the Stewarts' house one day and found them both in the old house in the backyard. He decided not to bother them at the time, but what he saw made him think. They were sitting very close to each other, and while this could have been normal for a brother and sister, there was something more in their eyes. He couldn't explain it, and quickly forgot the episode. But now it started to come back to him like a puzzle that wouldn't let him rest. When Leanna returned home that evening, she opened her old diary. She hadn't touched it for a long time, but today she wanted to look at the old entries. They were childish and naive, but at the same time they contained a truth that she was afraid to admit. Today he was by my side again. I don't know how I would have lived without him. No one will understand how much I love him, no one but him, but I can't tell him that. Leanna reread these lines, and her heart was filled with the same emotions as it was then. She knew that this diary was her biggest secret, and if someone found out about its existence, everything would fall apart. She put it back in the box, hid it under a pile of things, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her face, though beautiful, was tired, with a hint of sadness in her eyes. She knew that Thomas suspected something. He had always been smart, too attentive to details, but he could never find out the truth. Nathan and Leanne had always been special, but what they had was never meant to be seen by the world. The sun was slowly disappearing behind the horizon, and the city of Greenville was enveloped in a silence that seemed too thick for a small town. The night was particularly cold this time, as were the memories that were slowly returning to Leanne and Nathan. Their bond, rooted in childhood, was taking on new shades, invisible to outsiders, but clearly felt by them. For several days after the conversation with Thomas, Leanne felt tense. Her attention was often distracted by trivial matters, and she found herself becoming more cautious in her interactions with Nathan. Their special closeness, which had once seemed natural to her, now, under Thomas's heavy gaze, caused her a certain sense of anxiety. She couldn't put her finger on exactly why, but the feeling that someone was watching her back never left her. "You've been different lately," Nathan said one evening as they ate dinner in the large dining room of the house. "What's wrong?" "Nothing much," Leanna answered quickly, looking away. "Just a lot of work." "I know you, Leanna. You're hiding something." She couldn't tell him that she was having flashbacks and that Thomas was beginning to suspect something. "I'm fine, Nathan, don't worry." Nathan looked at her closely and then nodded, though he didn't believe a word she said. He had always seen right through her, and now he too felt that something was wrong. Leanna was thinking too much about the past, which was closely connected to their childhood, haunted Leanna at night. In her dreams, she often returned to the time when she and Nathan were children. Those carefree days in the backyard, where they created their own world, seemed so far away, yet so vivid in her memory. One day, when they were about 10 years old, they were sitting together on an old blanket in their hidden place, the treehouse. They were alone, as always, and the world seemed too far away from that small corner where they spent almost all their free time. "You know, Leanna," Nathan said then, looking at her with his serious eyes that belied his age, "we will always be together, right?" She nodded, as sure of that as she was of anything else. That moment was forever etched in her memory. From that moment on, she knew their connection was special. No one could understand them, but they didn't need to. Now, however, looking at Nathan as an adult, Leanna began to feel that something had changed. Was it possible that their hidden intimacy, which had been going on since childhood, had become something dangerous? She couldn't find an answer to this question, but she realized more and more that someone else was beginning to notice it too. The next day, Thomas came to the Stewarts' house again for a visit. He was working with Nathan on a new project, but his suspicions about the relationship between the siblings were only growing. He decided to ask Leanne about their childhood. Maybe something in their story would give him a clue. They were sitting on the terrace when Thomas began to reminisce about the old days. "I remember how you and Nathan were always together as children," he said. "You were, as they say, inseparable. How did you manage to maintain such a close relationship for so many years?" Liana felt her hands begin to tremble slightly, but she didn't let on her excitement. "We've always been friends," she replied, trying to sound as calm as possible. "We just have a lot in common, that's all." Thomas looked at her carefully. He knew she was not telling him something. "You know, I've noticed something interesting. You and Nathan are, well, let's just say a little more than just close. Has it always been like this?" Leanne sighed. She hadn't expected Thomas to be so direct, but something in his voice made her think. "We've just always been together," she said, looking away. "I remember coming to your house once when you were teenagers and seeing the two of you in that old house in the backyard. Something seemed strange to me at the time, and now I can't stop thinking about it." Leanne felt a wave of panic rise inside her. "Thomas," she began, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice. "It was so long ago. We were children. Why does it even matter now?" Thomas leaned forward and looked her straight in the eye. "Because I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong, Liana. And I feel like you're hiding something." Liana felt that the conversation had gone too far. She quickly stood up and smiled, trying to look calm. "I'm sorry, Thomas, but I have to go. I have a lot of things to do." Thomas watched her disappear into the house, feeling his suspicions growing stronger. Later that evening, Liana picked up her old diary again. She sat down on the bed and slowly turned the pages, as if looking for answers to questions that haunted her. There were her most intimate thoughts, written down in moments of weakness when she could no longer keep her feelings inside. "I can't hide it anymore," she wrote in one of the entries. "My love for Nathan is more than just brotherly affection. I'm afraid it's wrong, but I can't help it. I know he feels the same way, but no one will ever know." These words reminded her of the moments when they were children, when their connection seemed so natural and safe. But now everything had changed. Her feelings had grown darker, and she was afraid that it could ruin their lives. Liana hid the diary back in its old place where no one could find it. But something deep inside her told her that she would not be able to keep it a secret for long. Nathan walked up to her room and knocked on the door. "Are you okay?" he asked, opening the door and seeing her thoughtful expression. "Yes," she replied, quickly standing up and smiling. "Just a lot on my mind." The night covered Greenville with a thick, pitch-black cover. The town seemed immersed in a silence that drowned out even the whisper of the wind between the trees. The Stewart house was also asleep, but the tension in it was palpable at every turn. Liana stood by the window in her room, looking at the gray moon slowly rising above the rooftops. Her thoughts were heavy and chaotic. Over the past few weeks, something in her relationship with Nathan had steadily changed. What had once seemed secret and hidden from the eyes of the world was now a burden they could no longer carry. Ever since Thomas had spoken about his suspicions, Nathan had become colder, more reserved. It scared her. She remembered how they grew up together, how they had a special closeness since childhood. What had once been their secret was now threatening their very existence. All these feelings they had been hiding for years began to come out, destroying them from the inside. Liana couldn't ignore this tension, which was growing rapidly, like the scum in a pot about to explode. The sound of the door opening broke the silence. Nathan walked into the room, his gaze so intense that it gave Liana a chill. "Are you awake?" he asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I feel like something's changed," she said quietly, finally turning to him. Nathan sighed and stood up, walking around the room several times, as if looking for a way out of this invisible trap. "We can't live like this anymore, Liana," he said at last. His voice sounded hard, cold, without the tenderness she was used to. "I know," she whispered. "But what can we do?" There was no answer. The room fell silent, broken only by the soft rustling of the trees outside the window. Liana felt that this moment was a point of no return. She felt that this was no longer her brother, but a completely different person who looked at her as an enemy. Late at night, When the whole town was already asleep, she suddenly heard a dull, thudding noise coming from the windows of the Stewart house. A faint light flickered in the dark corridor. Something had gone wrong in the middle of the night. Liana was lying in her room, trying to find peace in her insomnia, when she suddenly heard the floor creaking behind her door. A coldness pierced her body that she couldn't shake. Her heart beat faster. Nathan had to be downstairs. But why was he here, next to her? She got out of bed, and at that moment the door was jerked open. In the darkness, she saw Nathan, his face contorted with anger she had never seen before. He was holding something in his hands, a metal object that shone in the moonlight. Liana had time to open her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Nathan rushed forward. Liana's scream cut through the silence of the night, but it was the last sound to escape her throat. A metal object sliced through the air and hit her on the head. She fell to the floor from the impact, and blood began to spread rapidly under her body. Nathan looked at her with cold despair, as if she were something that needed to be completed. He hit her again and again until silence returned to the room. Blood covered his hands, and he stood silently over the body, looking at the work of his hands. His heart was beating fast, and his brain hadn't yet had time to realize what had happened. He felt a strange emptiness inside. When he was done, he put the murder weapon on the floor and took a few deep breaths. Liana's life was gone. Now all that remained was to hide it all. The next morning, the world seemed even more gray and empty. When Liana's body was found, her room looked like the scene of a terrible tragedy. The police arrived on the scene shortly after a call from neighbors who had heard a suspicious noise in the house late at night. They found Nathan downstairs at the kitchen table, his hands shaking and his eyes blank. He was not saying anything. All his actions seemed mechanical, automatic. Detectives quickly arrived at the scene, including experienced investigator Maxwell Reed, a veteran of the local police who had dealt with brutal murders many times. But even he was shocked by the brutality of this crime. "What do we have?" he asked the young officer who met him at the doorstep. Her body was found on the bedroom floor around 3 in the morning. There were many signs of violence. It seems to have been a particularly brutal murder. The officer paused, feeling how difficult it was to say. Maxwell entered the house, examining every corner. He knew that every detail could make a difference. When he reached the second floor, he stopped in front of Liana's room. Her body had already been removed, but the traces of blood and chaos still testified to the horrors that had taken place here. "Who found her?" he asked, keeping his eyes on the floor. "Her brother, Nathan Stewart. Says he was sleeping downstairs and didn't hear anything until he found her in the morning," the officer answered with a hint of doubt in his voice. "That seems suspicious." Maxwell rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He walked around the room, carefully examining the signs of a struggle. Something about this murder seemed too planned, almost cold-blooded. It was hard to believe that it had happened in a state of passion. "We need to talk to him," Maxwell said, turning to the officer, "and go through all the security footage. This guy is hiding something." The Greenville police station woke up to the sound of keyboards clicking and phones ringing. Detective Harris was sitting at his desk, sipping his morning coffee, when his partner, Detective Johnson, approached him, holding fresh reports. "New case, Harris. A nighttime murder, brutal and suspiciously cold-blooded," Johnson said, tossing the file on the table. Harris looked up to meet his colleague's gaze. Johnson was one of the most reliable men in the precinct, and Harris could always count on his intuition. They had worked together for many years and had managed to understand each other at a glance. Harris leaned back in his chair, pulled out a cigarette and rolled it in his hands without lighting it. "What do we have?" he asked, glancing at the file. "Killed in her bed last night. Her brother, Nathan Stewart, was at home but says he didn't hear anything. The police think it's suspicious, but there's no hard evidence yet," Johnson said as he read the details from the report. "Sounds like a case where there's more to it than just a family tragedy." "The brother?" Harris frowned. "And how did he react?" "Too calm, I think," Johnson added as he opened another report. "The murder is very brutal, but he didn't even try to explain why he didn't hear anything. That's disturbing." "Let's go," Harris said decisively, grabbing his coat from the rack. "I want to see this brother, and also to talk to everyone who was close to Liana." The Stewart house seemed even gloomier in the afternoon. Detectives Harris and Johnson stood in the yard, surveying the crime scene. The dense tree canopy created a shadow that seemed to protect the house from daylight. "Nice place, quiet neighborhood, but there's something about this house that's disturbing," Johnson said, nodding at the windows which were covered with thick curtains. "It seems too perfect from the outside, but my gut tells me something dark is hiding inside," Harris agreed, pulling out a notebook. "Let's start by talking to Nathan. He's the key figure in this case right now." They were answered by an elderly neighbor who had seen the police earlier and knew what was going on. She led them across the threshold into the living room where Nathan Stewart was sitting. His face remained emotionless. His eyes were staring off into space, as if his thoughts were somewhere far away from reality. He looked tired, but too calm for a man who had just lost his sister. "Mr. Stewart, we're from the police, Detectives Harris and Johnson. We need to ask you a few questions about your sister." Harris began the conversation in a calm but confident tone. "Sure," Nathan answered briefly, not even bothering to look up at the detectives. Harris noticed that there was a notebook on Nathan's desk, its pages crumpled and looking shabby. He didn't know if it mattered, but it was one of those little things he always noticed. "Tell us about last night." "Were you at home with Leanna?" Johnson asked, taking careful notes. "Yes. We had dinner together and then I went to bed. She stayed in her room," Nathan answered briefly, licking his dry lips. "Did you hear anything suspicious? No noise, screaming, struggling?" Harris asked, looking at Nathan more closely. "I was asleep," he answered coldly, with an indifference that confused the detectives. "Tell me, how would you describe your relationship with your sister? Were you close?" Harris asked, trying to catch at least some emotion on Nathan's face. Nathan paused for a moment before answering. "We were always close." His voice was hollow. "She was my family, the only family I've ever had." "Then why do you seem so distant now that she's gone?" Johnson asked, sharply, losing his patience, trying to elicit some kind of reaction. Nathan did not answer. "I think we need to take a look at her room," Harris said, standing up. Nathan nodded slowly and pointed to the upstairs door. Leanna's room remained the same as it had been that night. The police had taken the body away, but the traces of struggle and blood still testified to the horrific events that had taken place. "This doesn't look like a random murder," he said quietly to Johnson. "There was something deeper going on here." "I feel it too," Johnson nodded. "We need to find out more about their past. See if there was anything special about their relationship." The detectives were looking around the room when Johnson suddenly noticed an important detail: an old diary hidden under a pile of books on a shelf. It looked old and badly worn, as if it had been read many times. "What is it?" Harris asked, coming closer. "A diary. It looks like it belonged to Leanne," Johnson replied, taking it out and opening it carefully. There were many entries on the pages, made in small handwriting that was difficult to make out. But one of the last pages caught their attention. It contained only a few lines. "We will always be together, even if it's wrong, but I can't hide it anymore. I'm afraid that soon everything will be revealed." Asterisk. "What the hell is this?" Johnson asked, reading the lines. "The first hint that things were not as simple as they want us to think," Harris said. "We need to check their backgrounds and talk to Thomas. Maybe he knows more than he's telling us." Thomas was sitting in a local coffee shop when the detectives found him. He looked confused, nervously drinking his coffee and looking around as if he was afraid someone was watching him. "Thomas, we want to talk about Leanna and Nathan." Harris sat down next to him. Thomas said that he didn't know anything, but added that the relationship between the siblings was quite strange. "There was something between them, but I can't say what. Maybe I'm making it up. I think their relationship was closer than brotherly." After talking to Thomas, the detectives left the coffee shop and decided to work on this version. The morning in Greenville was cold and gloomy. Detectives Harris and Johnson arrived at the office with new evidence they had obtained after the previous testimony. Right there in their interview room was an old diary Leanne Stewart had found in her room. It looked unremarkable. A soft cover, slightly worn, with crumpled pages. However, for the detectives, it was the key to understanding the secrets of the Stewart family. "Look at this." Harris put the diary on the table, and both detectives began to look through its entries. Many of the things she wrote indicate that something more serious was going on in the family than just brotherly relations. Johnson flipped through the pages, coming across numerous entries about Leanne's experiences. Many of them were about her feelings for Nathan, her fears, and the secrets she carried inside her. "Right here," Johnson said, stopping at one of the entries written in capital letters. "I can't hide our feelings anymore. It's not right, but I can't live without him." "This is a clear indication that there was more than just brotherly affection between them," Harris said, immersing himself in the reading, "and it could be a clue to the motive for the murder." The detective's eyes crossed, and they realized that this relationship could have been the cause of the conflict. The feelings of love and prohibition could not but lead to tragedy. At that time, Nathan was sitting on the couch in his living room, lost in thought. He kept thinking about the events that had happened that night. Every sound in the house, every shadow reminded him of Liana, of how easily she could have disappeared. But his fears were not just about loss. Nathan felt that his secret, the one he had been hiding so carefully, was about to be revealed. His face became increasingly nervous. He often looked down at Liana's old diary, which was left unprotected on the table. Nathan knew that she had written about them, about their relationship, about how much they loved each other, and that he could not let anyone find out the truth. The door opened, and Thomas, his old friend, walked in. He looked worried, and Nathan felt his anxiety level rise. "Nathan, I heard that the police are investigating what happened. You need to be careful," Thomas said, sitting down next to him. "There's nothing I can do," Nathan replied, trying to stay calm. "Leanne was my sister. I couldn't hurt her." Thomas hesitated, his face filled with uncertainty. "But you know their questioning could lead to you," he said gently. "I don't want you to get in trouble." "I don't know anything," Nathan repeated, trying to convince both himself and Thomas. But deep inside, he knew that no one could erase the memories that were hidden in Liana's diary. He needed to destroy all the evidence before it was too late. The detectives returned to the office to analyze the new evidence. They discussed the importance of Thomas's testimony and couldn't help but notice that their focus on the Stewart family was only growing. "We should talk to the neighbors," Johnson suggested. "See if any of them heard or saw anything suspicious that night." Harris nodded, approving of the idea. "And we also need to find out why Leanne was hiding her diary. Could she have written down something important about their relationship?" Harris said, thinking of the loose ends that still needed to be untangled. They went to the house next door, where an older couple lived who had known the Stewarts for years. The neighbors, who often talked to Liana, could provide valuable information about her personal life. A middle-aged woman met them on the doorstep, her eyes looking sad. "Can we ask you a few questions about Liana?" Harris asked, trying to be sensitive. The woman nodded, and they went into the room where she served them tea. "I always thought Liana was a very special girl," she began. "She was always so thoughtful, as if she was holding something important inside. I heard her arguing with Nathan sometimes." "What could you tell me about their relationship?" Johnson asked, trying to pick up on the details. "I noticed that there was a secret between them." The woman paused. "They never talked about it openly, but their looks, they said more than words. I always felt that something was wrong." The detectives looked at each other, realizing that their investigation was reaching a new level. Every thread they pulled led to more and more complexity. While Harris and Johnson were returning to the office, Nathan continued to fight his inner demons at home. He hid Liana's diary in a place where no one could find it. However, his anxiety did not go away. He knew that the detectives were getting closer to the truth. At home, he was increasingly anxious. Every phone call, every sound from outside was perceived as a threat. He could not allow his secret to be revealed. His mind tried to convince him, but fear stumbled at every thought. Nathan realized that he was already getting tangled up in the net of his worries. He was watching his life turn into a mess, and it was all because he couldn't be honest, even with himself. The moment he decided that he had nothing else to rely on, his heart beat faster. He knew that even one mistake could lead to his secrets being revealed. In this chaos, in a world of secrets, he was not only a victim, but also an executioner. The history of the Stewart family had long since sunk to the bottom, and now that everything was beginning to surface, Nathan was trying with all his determination to stop this process. With each new investigation, the detective's shadows of the past became more and more apparent, and the thought crept into his mind. Could it be his secret that caused Liana's death? The morning in Greenville promised to be gloomy, but Detectives Harris and Johnson were determined. Their investigations had reached a critical point, and with each new piece of evidence, the truth was getting closer. With the start of a new day, they looked again at Liana's diary entries. This time, its words not only hinted at secrets, but also began to paint a picture that led to a shocking discovery. "This diary holds the key to everything," Harris said, taking a deep breath. "It's more than just notes about their relationship. It's a terrible story, full of anxiety and pain." Johnson nodded as he studied the other notes, which revealed more and more details. In one of the notes, Liana wrote about despair, about how hard it was to fight her feelings for Nathan. She described her fears and pangs of conscience, urging herself to stop this forbidden passion. "She wrote that there was some anxiety between them," Johnson noted. "Doesn't that indicate that one of them might have been in danger?" Harris nodded, sensing that the evidence was pointing back to Nathan, but he couldn't be 100% sure. This feeling deepened. At this point, Nathan, trying to avoid questions, withdrew more into himself. He tried to remain calm, but his inner world was shaking under the pressure. He knew that the detectives were getting closer to the truth, and it was weighing on his mind. The detectives decided to interview a few more neighbors who could provide more information about the Stewart family. On one of their visits, they met an elderly woman who seemed to know all the secrets. "I knew Leanne since she was a little girl," she began, her voice trembling with memories. "She was always special, and her relationship with her brother, it was a real tragedy." "What tragedy?" Harris asked, trying to find out more. "They grew up together, and their family was not easy. But one day, I heard that Leanne had found out something about their mother. I don't know the details, but it could have been something terrible." Her words stunned the detectives. This was a new twist. What kind of secret could be so shocking as to lead to murder? When the detectives returned to the office, they felt that time was running out. Nathan, burdened with feelings, remained on edge. He knew that Liana's diary could be fatal for him. He could only hope that he could hide his secret a little longer. Meanwhile, the detectives, realizing that all this was the result of forbidden love, began to put the puzzle together. "We'll need to go back to Nathan," Harris said, watching the circumstances escalate. "The more we learn about their past, the more likely we are to solve this case." At the last moment, the detectives realized that Nathan had something to hide from them. They turned to the diary again, and it was their last chance to uncover the truth. In one of the last notes, Leanne described her concern that their parents might have had some secrets that affected their relationship. Harris mentioned that he had heard rumors of dark secrets in the Stewart family. Leanne learned that Nathan was adopted, which could have led to conflict between them. She may have planned to make it public so she could be with him, he speculated. Leanne's murder was the result not only of an emotional conflict, but also of a deep psychological trauma that had been holding the Stewarts back for years. Nathan, feeling his secrets getting heavier and heavier, decided that the only way out was to kill Liana, who could have revealed the truth. After years of hiding his feelings and their forbidden love, he concluded that the only thing that could stop their relationship from being revealed was her death. Liana learned about their mother's secret and wanted to tell the truth, but her desire to reveal everything became the impetus for her murder. When the detectives came to this conclusion, they immediately went to Nathan to question him about the details of that evening. Some of his belongings were found in the room where the tragedy occurred. The murder weapon, an antique candlestick, was thoroughly washed, and the forensic analysis proved that it had residues of the victim's blood on it, and belonged to Nathan. It was found in the man's room. This evidence became the key to the case. Nathan, trying to confuse the detectives, initially claimed that he was not in the room when Liana died, but, feeling the pressure, he began to appear more and more nervous and contradictory. "I didn't want to kill her," he shouted when the detective started asking questions about the knife. "I just couldn't lose her. She was the only one who understood me." "You did it, Nathan," Harris said, looking at him coldly. A look of horror appeared on Nathan's face, and he realized that the detectives already knew the truth. When their eyes met, he knew there was no point in denying it. "Yes, I killed her," he exclaimed, his voice sounding deaf and hopeless. "I couldn't let anyone know the truth about me and our relationship. I just wanted everything to stay the way it was." The detectives gathered all the evidence and called a lawyer to start the process. Now it was not only about punishing Nathan, but also about drawing attention to the deep family problems that led to this tragedy. The verdict was announced a few months later. Nathan was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The judge, aware of his mental state, gave him the opportunity to change. During Liana's trial, the relatives present in the courtroom felt confused and angry. They realized that their family was destroyed and full of secrets that they had tried so hard to hide.